Anti-intellectualism, is it rampant on the Newspoll?
Well, you know, predictably I would say not. You know, I'm trying to carefully, you know, consider your question. I don't think so. I mean, if you look at review, if you look at I'll start with, you know, if you look at review, if you look at the writing that Nicholas Rothwell brings to cultural matters in review, whether they be Indigenous art, whether they be, I think review is as much in that proud tradition as it ever was. I would very much disagree with the contention that it's dumbed down. I wouldn't think, if you look at Inquirer, the section in the paper I edit, that it is intellectually weaker than it was 10 years ago. I'm trying to think of the intellects who may have once written for it who no longer. I'm really...
Could I perhaps be helpful to Catherine? Are you nominating perhaps Janet Alberts and Judith Sloan? Who have you got specifically in mind?
Well, I'll just be a bit more specific.
Inferior intellect.
I would agree with what you're saying about the weekend paper. It's more the sort of courage that happens on a daily basis around, well, for instance, Kevin Donnelly is a commentator. I know he's now an advisor to the Prime Minister as well at Christopher Pyne, but he's not really regarded as a first-rate, you know, his analysis is not, to be honest, regarded as first-rate when you talk to a lot of people, policy experts or experts in education. I think, so I guess what I'm saying is I think in the so-called culture wars, there was a kind of growing breach, if you like, between people who are seen as sort of intellectuals or thinkers and the tack, I guess, that the Australian might have taken on a daily basis and sometimes even on their pages. I mean, I think Janet Alberts is, you know, an intelligent conservative commentator, so she would be I would not single her out, and I think it's important to have some strong conservative voices. I think that's helpful to the public spirit of the debate. It's more to do with the quality sometimes of the analysis, and I think it's perceived as being quite one-sided when it comes to things like the cultural war.
Politically one-sided, ideologically one-sided.
I think it's sort of ideological is probably a word that would spring to mind. And I think this is a perception that's out there, and that's why I wanted to
Can I just respond briefly before we throw to others? I think that in education, for example, and whilst not commenting on this, you know, the specific merits of the person you nominated, I think we have a range of voices in education, in the higher education section, and also in our schools-based reporting. I mean, we've done a lot of work with the Grattan Institute, with Ben Jensen, with looking at the Gonski reform agenda from all sides, and I think in education, I think we take education far more seriously than any of our competitors, and as I just said, we have a range of voices really from across the political spectrum engaged in that. I'd also say that more generally, I mean, it's a common critique, a common misconception, or, you know, that we have only conservative commentators, and of course you all know, if you read us, we have, you know, we've had Philip Adams for 35 years. We have a range of voices from the left. I mean, we've had Beeby for a long time. We've had Labor politicians, we have Liberal politicians, and we have academics from all sides of the debate. So, yeah, look, that's all I can really say, but I'm happy to throw to...
David, do you have a view on this? Did you hire people for their intellectual credentials?
For the analytical contribution they could make, yes, sure. And they didn't have to be one side or the other. In fact, there's one little thing. You were talking about Rupert before. One little thing I've forgotten because it wasn't a phone call. Rupert once asked me to sack Philip Adams.
Oh, I hired him.
You hired him. and
well, second time round.
I was having been a leader writer in 1975. I was very, very conscious of what happened to the paper in 1975, both in terms of reputation and its circulation. Circulation didn't happen until 1976 when the subscriptions were renewed, but it just collapsed. Yeah. So we're trying to get more balance into the paper then, in the early 90s, you know, trying trying to make the paper more politically balanced. And Philip Adams was at that stage was kind of the icon of that. So I didn't sack him. But funnily enough, though,
How did you avoid doing his master's business?
I just never mentioned it again. Funnily enough, I'm told, when I came back to the Australian in 1976, everyone was on individual contracts. All the contributors were on contract, except two, Ruth Ostro and Philip Adams. And they were the last two to be persuaded to sign up. And the point of that was basically to give the paper the rights, the copyright, to publish their contributions in whatever form. So eventually Philip and Ruth both signed up. Then a few years later, I'm told at a meeting at Quadrant, Keith Windshuttle was talking about what a terrible communist I was because I was the guy who gave Philip Adams a contract.
More questions, yes.
Yeah, this was for David. You were talking about that episode with the first challenge by P.G. Paul.
Yes.
You get to the end of this and he said, well, we don't have a problem then. What would have happened if we had a problem? If you'd said, I want to support Paul, I'm going to do it. What would have been the nature of the problem? What would he have done?
As the lawyers would say, we're absolutely 100% entitled to speculate. And that would be all it was. All would be speculation. I would imagine, I would hope, that if Rupert had disagreed, that he would have actually listened to my long-winded argument and may well have been persuaded. As he was persuaded to back Kevin Rudd in 2007.
By means that we don't yet know.
But yeah, the
Sounds
short
like
answer
another
is,
book.
I don't know.
Yes, I'm sorry, Karen.
Sally, I've been mentioned of it. There's been a lot of discussion on the panel about the historical nature of the Australian and its profitability. Can you tell us a bit about its profitability at the moment? There's been lots of speculation that it hasn't been profitable for many years, for example.
Michelle, are you happy to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Look, we have had some issues in recent years, and I think recent years, and I think Chris Mitchell has spoken about them recently. We had a big investment in digital, and it did dent our profitability absolutely for a number of years. It was nothing like the figure reported in the ABC. $50 million figure that they quoted. It was far south of that. But, yeah, I don't think there's any secret about the fact that the last couple of years have been tough. And as I said, it's an investment in digital. It's also the fact that, like other newspapers, we've, struggled pretty much with advertising revenues and a declining print circ. We're all trying to make money out of digital and to increase our paid subscriptions. But as I said at the start, I think we feel pretty positive going forward based on the number of paid subscriptions we have, and whilst our circ has declined about 11%, our print circ over the past decade, the losses from Fairfax have been more than double, triple that. So we feel pretty positive going forward, and that's about all I can say.
I think there's another element to this, and that is how you account it. Because the Australian is one product in a stable of many, and if you add up the costs attached to the Australian and the revenues generated by the Australian, you'll get one figure. If you add up the contribution of the Australian to the overall, you get another figure. And the overall is relevant because it's the same presses that print the Australian and the Telegraph and the Herald and the Advertiser around the country and the Courier Mail. It's the same press crews. If you didn't have the Australian, those same people, those same presses, that same infrastructure would still have to be used for the others. It would be somewhat underutilised. So what you need is a forensic accountant or what are those people who work out the, I don't know what they're called, a financial magician to work out a true position, because you can argue it from either side. Take the Australian out of what you got now and the costs to News Corp Australia would go whoosh. But that doesn't mean to say that the Australian makes a contribution, doesn't mean to say that the Australian puts money onto the bottom line of the overall. But you'd have to be able to identify very much larger losses than you have at the moment to be able to say by taking it out you'll be better off. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks. Mike Beeby, Canberra, freelance writer, also ex-native volunteers, postgraduate advocate. I've got a few questions, hopefully they're related and hopefully they're not too dispersive, or questions taken from the panel. You mentioned earlier that Australia reflects the diversity. Very good point. But with change, relationships change. I'm interested in the panel, any feedback on how their perception, how the relationship has changed with the readers and vice versa. Two, to Paul, I spoke to Paul years ago, you may remember, at the National Library, and I share the same intellectual curiosity as Rupert Murdoch, not a background. But it seems to be an obituary averse paper. I've read a lot of papers, I've travelled overseas. Fortunate. You rely on the London paper, certainly in Washington, New York, it's obituary heaven. It's nice. It's a place, isn't it? Anyway, but to op-ed, leading to the third point, finally last week, apology there. Do you have a set stable of op-ed talking heads, or is it? And how do you rely on a sort of a set panel? That's all I can say. Sorry, perhaps you can answer.
Right, Mike. Perhaps if I kick it off, in my year, there was no set stable. We had a lot of people in-house who were capable of covering a lot of territory. If we felt that we weren't capable of bringing insights and transparency to big issues, we would go out and seek articles, seek experts to report. In your era, Warren?
Much the same. Working on a smaller budget, it was always difficult to get the quality of contributor that we would have desired. Although the reputation of the Australian was sufficient for people to want to take a cut in contributor rate to be in the paper. We had a solid core of people in our bureaus and in our sections, and covered the whole area more than adequately, I think. As for relationships with readers, it's difficult to say. We always encouraged interchange between readers and the paper, and I think we were fairly successful, but it's very difficult to quantify.
Yeah. David?
Yes, for the op-ed, I think you have a set stable, if you like, of regular contributors, and you'd add to that with occasional contributors depending on the issue. But I think the set stable grows over time as the paper becomes more profitable, because you've got to pay these people every week. You know? And some of them are quite expensive. I remember a number that sticks in my head from that period when Gerard Henderson was writing a weekly column for the Australian. He was getting paid, I think, $900 a week. That was big money in 1989. He then went to Fairfax on a joint deal with the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, and they paid him $1,500 a week. And there's just no way in the world we could imagine competing with that sort of money. But certainly as the paper became more profitable, it did have more regular people week by week. And then relationship with the readers, it's a difficult issue. One of the issues I try to grapple with is journalists will talk about the readers, but really they're writing for themselves and their friends. And that's a sort of mental construct they have. And we tried an experiment which is ended up becoming a bit of a joke, but I think in being a joke still had some little effect. As we constructed an ideal reader, and this ideal reader was a woman, an educated, I think, a lawyer, I think, or an architect. She's an educated woman with pretty sophisticated tastes, just to get people, and she lived in Melbourne, just to get people to stop thinking about Sydney, and their mates.
How old was she, and how many children did she have?
Where did she sit in the newsroom?
She had three children. She was about 43, I think.
Does she still sit in the newsroom?
Well, that's quite funny. I do remember Catherine McWilliam, David. I do remember her. Look, I guess I just say that I think we do have a stable of op-ed writers. Very few. We do have some of our members of staff who write for the op-ed pages. Not many. You know, Dennis Shanahan has a spot, obviously Paul Kelly has a spot, a few people on staff have a spot, and then we have a regular stable of contributors, people like Henry Ergas, who we use both through the week on the op-ed and Inquirer, and they're regular contributors and regularly appear on the op-ed page. But it's also important to keep a few slots, as we do every day, free from your regular, you know, set contributors for great pieces that come in that are, and indeed we commission extra pieces from Voices to add to that stable. I think that serves, you know, it keeps the pages fresh, and two, it gives our readers some continuity because readers have their favourites, and readers look forward, for example, to reading Paul's piece on a Saturday, or to read Greg Sheridan's regular column, So you've got to do both, I think. As for our relationship with our readers, it's been quite interesting over the 50th because we've been counting down a year a day for the past 40-something days, and we've had a tremendous amount of feedback. Now, letter writers are a particular breed of reader. They're very much engaged by virtue of the fact they write so often to us, but it's been fascinating to look at our mailbag, if you like, electronic mailbag these days, and see how much feedback we've had, because, you know, a lot of our readers have been subscribing for a very long time, and they've loved the double-page spread that Graham's been editing, looking back at the paper's history and the positions we held and so on. So I think our relationship with our readers is pretty healthy, and they certainly let us know if we give them any, you know, nasty surprises or shake them up a little bit.
I think probably time for one or two more questions. Bridget.
Bridget from Colby, that discussion leads us in beautifully to the next session, and I hadn't realised, David, that the model reader that you had in mind was a woman from an educated woman from Melbourne. I think that's really fascinating, and hopefully we can unpack that a bit further. When you were discussing your competitors, you focused in particular on the Sydney Morning Herald and touched on the Financial Review. David, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the Bulletin, which I know you edited. Was it, when you went back to the Australian, seen as something of a competitor with the Australian in terms of its role in covering politics and setting the agenda in the 80s and 90s?
I think it was a little bit the other way, actually. When I was at the Bulletin, the thing that really worried me was the improvement in the weekend, the Saturday newspapers, and I thought that was a real threat to the Bulletin. Excuse me, that the Saturday papers were very current. They could be writing on Friday for Saturday. The Bulletin was writing on Friday for the following Wednesday. And I thought it was a real danger to the Bulletin. Having said that, I think there was a time, and it's before Les Hollings really hit his stride, I think, at the Australian. There's a time when the Bulletin really did lead the way on the discussion about the nature of the Australian economy, the nature of a competitive economy, the nature of an open economy. The Bulletin in the mid-80s, late 80s, changed course and decided that Richard Walsh decided that politics and politics and the economy didn't sell anymore, and the Bulletin should change its nature and became more of a lifestyle focused magazine. And that, to my mind, was the point at which the Saturday paper just rode right over the top of the Bulletin, and it never recovered. From that point on, as soon as Kerry Packer passed away, the Bulletin was finished, because it was only Kerry's commitment that kept it going.
Yes.
Margaret Van Peekeren, very similar question, but my one is the National Times during its years, and who can coincide with that, and how was the feeling of competition with the National Times?
You asked Paul about that.
Paul, would you like to edit that? You edited both. Sorry to break you from your reverie. I think he'd had his eyes on the horizon.
I don't think, well, I had 4 years on the National Times. I don't think we were particularly concerned about the Australian. We were a weekly publication. We were a news magazine in a newspaper format. We had a particular place in the political spectrum, pretty much the opposite of where the Australian was at that time. So we were developing a very strong brand, a combination of investigative journalism, but also pretty hard-headed commercial appeal in terms of tax reviews, tax supplements, wine supplements, and so on. And for a while that worked very successfully. The National Times sold around 104,000, 105,000 for quite a long period of time at a reasonable retail price. So the key to all this, I think, is getting your formula right. You know, you look at the marketplace and you identify your niche and get that right. Now, the National Times got it right for quite a while, but the marketplace always changes. It's constantly in flux, and people always then want to tamper with a model, and they're never satisfied. They say, oh, no, we can be doing better than this, let's change the arrangement. And often in changing the arrangement, you diminish the product, and I think that's what happened in the National Times.
Perhaps we could pose one final question to the panel out of the reference to the Bulletin. Kerry Packer, towards the more difficult days of the Bulletin, said, you have a magazine like this for profit or for influence. At the moment I have neither. Each of the panel, can we see, we'll start with you, David, can we see the day when Rupert or his successors may say the same?
Well, I'd hope we never see the day that they would say that the Australian is without influence. And I think the Australian has a much clearer idea of its idea to get its place in the marketplace than the Bulletin did in the 1980s, which is the period that Kerry was referring to. The other thing that shouldn't be forgotten, seeing this from afar, I don't know the details, but when News Corporation was split into two companies, the movie company and the newspaper company, Foxtel was put into the newspaper company. And Rupert said at the time, there's a reason for this. He says, just like when the TV station in Adelaide subsidised the Australian. So Foxtel is meant to be cross-subsidising the newspapers. So
he also pointed out the obvious, that it was very difficult to manage Foxtel in Australia from Hollywood.
Yes.
It's better to have it in the hands of some Australians who actually
and the Hollywood guys who want to get rid of the newspapers wouldn't have cared tuppence about Foxtel.
Yeah.
Yes. Sure. But on to answer your question, I don't. If that ever happens, it's a long time off.
Warren.
Well, I'd suggest that there were about 15 years when there was a very robust debate going on between Rupert and the board of News Limited about profit over influence. And it's fair to say that the board for a long time was unprepared to tolerate the losses that Rupert was. and that he kept it going, I suspect, because of its influence. And it's always been a major factor in his support for the Australian over the years.
Michelle?
Well, I'd agree with all of that, and probably just end where Paul began this morning. I mean, take it from Rickard himself when Paul asked him a couple of months ago, or a month ago in LA, about how long the Australian would last. He gave him that one-word answer: forever. That's all we need to know.
In one form or another. Thank you very much. You've been a lovely audience. Appreciate it.
Challenges, innovations, solutions. This is APAC, Australia's public affairs